Okay. The first initial matter, General Statute 138A15 requires me to inquire as to whether any member knows of any known conflict of interest or appearance of conflict with respect to matters before the committee today. If any member knows of a conflict of interest or appearance of a conflict, please state at this time. Hearing nothing, I believe we have no conflicts, and with that, we'll move on. And I hope everybody noticed we have two sets of minutes here to approve today, since we were not able to get to the November committee minutes last time. So we got both November and January. Let's start with November. Does anyone have any questions, suggestions, changes with respect to the November minutes? All right, hearing none, I will entertain a motion to approve the minutes then.
I'll move approval.
Commissioner Smith moves approval. A second?
Second. Bailey, I second.
Commissioner Bailey seconds. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, the November minutes are approved as written. Now we'll move on to the January 8th committee meeting and minutes for that meeting. Once again, anybody have any questions, issues, changes, corrections for those minutes?
The only thing that I would suggest is in the others in attendance, I'm listed as others in attendance, but I'm actually on the committee.
Oh, yeah, that is correct. All right, we should make that change to the, let's see, we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, that'd be all, yeah, all 7. Okay. Any other changes or corrections? All right, with that one change, which we will, I'll pass along to the staff, I guess, since she's not in here right now, but with that one change, I would accept the motion for approval.
So moved.
And a second? Commissioner Duggan moves to approve. Second?
Commissioner Bailey, second.
All right, Commissioner Bailey seconds again. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, those are approved with that one correction. Now, let's move on to, whoops, excuse me, I am on the wrong place on my agenda. All right, the first action item is the request for approval to proceed to the full commission to request approval to proceed to hearing on proposed revisions for air curtain incinerators and air curtain burners and the associated regulatory impact analysis. Good morning. Oops. Oh, I saw him walk up. I thought, wait a minute, we've changed speakers here. And Anna Delahunt will be presenting.
Hi, I'm Anna Delahunt with the DAQ, and today I'm presenting on revisions to 15A NCAC 02D 1904 air curtain incinerators and 15A NCAC 02Q 810 air curtain burners. So here are some acronyms and abbreviations I'll be using throughout the presentations for you to reference. So some background on 1904. Rule 02D 1904 sets conditions for the operation of air curtain incinerators, or ACIs, including applicability, permitting, opacity limitations, performance tests, and record-keeping requirements. So currently, the existing rule requires Title V permits for all ACIs, except for some temporary use ACIs used in disaster recovery. Also, throughout this presentation, I'll be using air curtain incinerators, or ACIs, and air curtain burners interchangeably because they were referred to the same thing. 1904 was previously amended to change all references to converters to ACIs, and we're doing the same to 810 in this rulemaking. So the rule was originally adopted and became effective on July 1st, 1996 to set requirements for air curtain burners. At that time, burners that had the potential to burn 15,000 tons of material or more per year were subject to Section 15A NCAC 02Q 500 Title V procedures. The EPA promulgated Federal New Source Performance Standards, or NSPS, and emission guidelines, EGs, for commercial and industrial solid waste incineration, or SISWI, units in 40 CFR Part 60, subparts Quad C and Quad D, respectively, on December 1st, 2000. These federal rules required all SISWI units to obtain and hold Title V permits, and EPA did clarify that SISWI units did include SISWI ACIs. On December 16, 2005, the EPA promulgated federal NSPS and EGs for other solid waste incineration, or OSWI, units under 40 CFR Part 60, subparts Quad E and Quad F, which required all OSWI units, including OSWI ACIs, to obtain and hold Title V permits. Under subparts Quad E and Quad F, certain ACIs are only subject to a small subset of the requirements, and these are termed OSWI ACIs for this analysis. These OSWI ACIs include ACIs with a capacity of less than 35 tons per day that burn only the materials listed below, which are 100% wood waste, 100% clean lumber, 100% yard waste, or 100% mixture of these materials. And collected from the general public and from residential, commercial, institutional, and industrial sources, and ACIs located at institutional facilities that burn any amount of also these materials below. And these materials have to be generated at that institutional facility. So this is a chart that breaks down the different types of ACIs that are included under the term OSWI ACI, and has the different definitions we mentioned before, and also new OSWI ACIs, as you can see, are subject to 40 CFR Part 60 subpart Quad E, and existing OSWI ACIs are subject to 40 CFR Part 60 subpart Quad F. And something else to know, the NSPS and EG requirements are nearly identical, so they're incorporated into this rule together. So similarly, the federal SISWI regulations, subpart Quad C and Quad D, carve out a subset of requirements for certain ACIs covered under those rules. And these ACIs are termed SISWI ACIs for this analysis. A SISWI ACI is an ACI with a capacity greater than or equal to 35 tons per day that burns only 100% wood waste, 100% clean lumber, or 100% mixture of only wood waste, clean lumber, and yard waste. So this is another chart that, like OSWI, breaks down the different parts of the definition of a SISWI ACI. Amendments to Rule 02D 1904, effective on August 4, 2004, increased the threshold for facilities needing a Title V permit from 15,000 tons per day to 77,000 tons per day. The readoption of 15A NCAC 02D 1904 on September 1, 2019, updated the rule to align with federal rules for SISWI and OSWI ACIs and required that all new and existing ACIs obtain a general Title V operating permit pursuant to 509 for permanent ACIs or 510 for temporary ACIs. On August 31st, 2020, the EPA performed a 5-year review of the NSPS and EG for OSWI units. Following this review, the EPA proposed changes to the NSPS and EG for OSWI units, including removal of the Title V requirement for OSWI ACIs.
Let me stop you right there and ask a question, because I think I'm a little confused on this. Back up to that previous slide, if you would. Now, the first bullet point says the threshold for needing a Title V permit was increased from 15,000 to 77,000 tons per day. But the next bullet, unless I'm misreading it, I think says that it requires all new and existing ACIs to obtain a Title V and doesn't include that threshold.
I think that was a response to a change in the federal rules.
Well, but what I'm asking here is why would all need a Title V if the threshold has been increased to 77,000 by the Fed?
I changed it from having a threshold to all require a Title V permit.
First bullet point was 04, the second one's 2019.
No, I understand that, but all right, so they went up and then they turned around and said, no, wait a minute, we're going to eliminate the threshold? Yeah.
If I may, Mr. Chairman, I think the first bullet's referring to a change to the state rule that DAQ made in 2004.
Okay.
And then the second bullet's referring to the categorical requirement for Title V permits that came about in the federal rules later.
Yes, yes.
Well, then let me ask you the question, I guess, which is why is EPA apparently requiring a Title V for what could be very small units here? If there's no threshold.
Well, part of this story is they're now removing those requirements. So that's what we're
Oh.
aiming to change. So that's forthcoming.
So they like to go back and forth. All right, sorry. Go
You
right
spoiled
ahead.
the ending.
Spoiler alert.
No.
So on April 17, 2024, the EPA finalized the elimination of the Title V permit requirement for OSV ACIs. The ACIs cannot be located at Title V major sources or be otherwise subject to Title V permit requirements, and they must also continue to comply with opacity limitations. The DAQ is proposing to amend 1904 to remove the Title V permit requirement for OSV ACIs. Additionally, the DAQ is proposing clarifying changes to the monitoring, record keeping, and reporting provisions based on comments from DAQ staff. Something else to note, on October 10, 2024, the General Assembly of North Carolina passed House Bill 149, also known as the Disaster Recovery Act of 2024, in response to Hurricane Helene. Section 10.5C of the Act stated that owners and operators of permanent and temporary ACIs, subject to subparts Quad E and Quad F, shall not be required to obtain a Title V operating permit. This change applies to OSV ACIs and is consistent with EPA's final action to revise the federal OSV rules in April of 2024. Section 10.5D of the Act requires the EMC to amend Rule O2D 1904 to be consistent with Section 10.5C, which will be in effect until the revised permanent rule is effective. Since Section 10.5 of the Act is already in effect, it is considered part of the baseline or business as usual operations for the purposes of this analysis. So the costs and savings discussed in this fiscal note are attributable to the Disaster Recovery Act of 2024 rather than this specific rulemaking. So here's a summary of the rule amendments that we are making to Rule O2D 1904. We're revising applicability language, revising definitions for temporary air curtain incinerators and temporary use air curtain incinerator use in disaster recovery. We're refining the particulate types for a PSD increment. We're adding requirements for managing ash, revised permit requirements to be consistent with 40 CFR Part 60 subparts Quad E and Quad F. Revise opacity limits to distinguish requirements for OSV and SISWI ACIs and to make them consistent with subparts Quad E and Quad F. Adding a requirement to notify DAQ of startup within 15 days of commencing operation and added requirements to keep daily logs.
One question here, already actually goes back to, well, on this slide, so do these rules then apply, or yeah, are we implementing what the General Assembly passed in October? Or federal requirements, or is there a conflict between those two?
So the General Assembly passed the removal of the Title V permit. And the other changes are separate changes to make the rule more like some parts it needed to be changed to more accurately comply with subparts Quad E and Quad F, and then also changes requested by the DAQ staff.
Okay.
On page 11.
Oh, slide 11.
Yeah, and if I may, Mr. Chairman, the last bullet on the bottom of slide 11 indicates that the provisions of the Disaster Recovery Act are already in effect.
You know, I saw that,
So-
but I wasn't sure whether this rule is going to change that in some way.
Cool. Question, how do we make that clear in the rule that this is in response, where the statutory required change is, or should we? Because it's back to the chairman's question is somebody at the General Assembly is going to say, if y'all specifically make that adjustment, it's hard for me to understand what y'all are saying to say we have or we haven't. It's like it's buried in here. How could we specifically pull that out and make that reference? Can we? How can we identify it easily?
Identify whether the change has been made to the rule.
For the requirement for that the General Assembly required us to make. How do we know we've done that versus what the chairman asked, part of the overall EPA rule? Or how do we know they're consistent if you just read the rule?
I don't know that there is a way to mark the language, but the actual revised rule will have, in addition to the rule history note,
Right.
that will show that the most recent revisions were in response to that session law. So it will cite the session law in the history note for the changes made in this version of the rule.
Okay, let me jump. Yeah, and I agree with you, Commissioner. I was just jumping out in front now because somebody's got to also explain this to the RRC too. And I guess I'm looking at council to
And
make sure
that's-
she knows what her footnote is or where this is exactly at, so the RRC can see, don't change that language. That was required by statute. That's statute language versus EPA. And I'm asking the question as you are, how's that process made easier?
Well, and I think y'all are both going in the right direction, but I think the history note's fine, but I think the question the chairman is asking is, though, if somebody sits down to look at these rules, will the changes that we've described here as being in effect already because they're in the statute, will they be reflected in the rule that somebody goes and looked at so they know that they're actually, that's the question, I think.
Yes, so we are changing the rule language to specify that these Osby units will no longer require Title V permits.
All right.
Yeah, there is specific language added to the draft rule on the agenda. The following air curtain incinerators shall not be required to obtain a Title V permit, and then sub-bullets it out from there. So I think that's the explicit
It pretty much takes care of it. Okay.
example. Yeah.
Yes. So we are also amending O2Q 810 air curtain burners. These rules are termed the 800 rules are termed the exclusionary rules, provided that certain types of facilities can be excluded from Title V permitting requirements in Rule O2Q 500 if their actual annual throughput or production rate remains below the threshold or exclusionary limit established in the O2Q 800 rule applicable to that industry. The exclusionary limits in each of the O2Q 800 rules are calculated as the highest throughputs that a facility could have while keeping emissions below the Title V major source thresholds. So these thresholds include 100 tons per year of each criteria pollutant, 10 tons per year of each individual hazardous air pollutant, or HAP, and 25 tons per year of all HAPs combined. And as I will explain later, this proposed rule revision will only be applicable to SISWI ACIs. Rule O2Q 810 was originally adopted and became effective on December 1st, 2005, and exempted facilities with only air curtain burners combusting less than 8,100 tons of land clearing debris per year from the Title V permit requirement. The 8,100 tons per year limit was calculated to correspond to the major source threshold of 100 tons per year of criteria pollutant using an emission factor of 12.23 grams particulate matter emissions per kilogram of land clearing debris burned, which is equivalent to 24.46 pounds of particulate matter per ton burnt. This emission factor comes from an October 1996 EPA study.
Let me stop you right there and just with a quick, I guess, question. So PM is the primary pollutant here, not CO?
So when we were looking at the emission factors, in the past there are these given set of emission factors, and PM was the one that was the highest. So it was sort of the limiting pollutant. So it's like one of the given criteria pollutants that has the highest emissions per ton burned and will reach the 100 tons per year threshold first.
Okay.
See, later we're using a new updated emission factor, and it does change from PM to CO.
Okay. Now, one other quick thing on the previous slide, you've got the statutory thresholds in here, 110 and 25. My question is there any real expectation that you're going to hit either 10 or 25 perhaps from these types of units?
So that's a great point. The OSWI ACIs don't really burn enough to reach it. So this rule is only applicable to SISWI ACIs.
But if they're burning wood and wood waste and so on, where are we getting HAPs?
These were the limit that really is applicable here is the 100 tons per year of criteria pollutants.
Right.
So these were just listing the possible source
All right.
thresholds.
All right. I was just trying to understand if that was likelihood that either of those thresholds were going to be hit, either the 10 or the 25.
Okay, thank you. So the DAQ is proposing to modify the exclusionary limit in 15A NCAC O2Q 810 to reflect updated emission factors and clarify that it does not supersede the permitting requirements of Rule O2D 1904. The proposed revisions to Rule 810 include recalculating the Title V exclusionary limit that exempts ACIs from the Title V permitting requirements in 15A NCAC 02Q 500 using emission factors for ACIs published by the San Joaquin Valley Air Pollution Control District in 2017. The limiting pollutant from these factors is carbon monoxide, which has an emission factor of 2.6 pounds of CO emitted per ton of material burned. This factor results in a new exclusionary limit of 76,000 tons of material burned per year. These ACI emission factors are more representative of current ACIs and are used for permitting ACIs currently in North Carolina and in other states. All OSWI ACIs in North Carolina burn less than 35 tons per day of only wood waste, clean lumber, yard waste, or a mixture of these materials, which equals a maximum of 12,775 tons of material per year. Consequently, Rule 810 will only apply to SISWI ACIs, which are still currently required to maintain a Title V permit. As a result, the proposed revisions to 810 would not change the current permitting requirements for any unit, but would serve as a sort of backstop in the event the EPA later removes the Title V permitting requirement for SISWI ACIs that burn only wood waste, clean lumber, yard waste, or a mixture of these materials. And we anticipate that the EPA will do this at some point in the future. To clarify this point, the rule is proposed to be modified to clarify that it does not supersede the permitting requirements of Rule 02D 1904. So here is a breakdown of the different amendments we are proposing to make to 810. So we're replacing all instances of the word air curtain burner with air curtain incinerators in the title and text. We're revising applicability so that all sources at a site utilizing this rule, not just those sources requiring a permit, are limited to one or more ACIs. We're updated the exclusionary limit to incorporate updated emission factors, revised timelines to be clear throughout the rule, revised permissible materials to be consistent with 40 CFR Part 60, subparts Quad E and Quad F, added language to clarify the rule does not supersede 1904, and revised requirements to specify the types of material combusted must be included in reports. So for the fiscal note for this rulemaking was approved by OSBM on March 3rd, 2025. Since the federal rules in Rule 02D 1904 currently require that all SISWI ACIs obtain a Title V permit regardless of annual emissions, the proposed changes to Exclusionary Rule 02Q 810 would not have any fiscal or environmental impact upon the rule changes becoming effective. And since the Disaster Recovery Act of 2024 serves as the baseline for this analysis, the removal of the Title V permitting requirement for OSWI ACIs does not result in any impacts attributable to the proposed rule amendments. Nevertheless, the fiscal note still characterizes and quantifies the estimated costs and savings to industry, local governments, and state government associated with a change in permit requirements. So currently in North Carolina, there are 18 facilities with OSWI ACIs that would no longer be required to obtain a Title V permit. They may still need to obtain a construction and operation permit, commonly referred to as a non-Title V permit, state permit, or small permit, issued pursuant to the provisions of 15A NCAC 02Q 300 if they do not qualify for one of the exemptions listed in 15A NCAC 02Q 102. And the exemption that would be most applicable in this scenario would be the exemption in 102D, which states that facilities whose actual emissions of particulate matter, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, volatile organic compounds, carbon monoxide, HAPs, and toxic air pollutants are each less than 5 tons per year, and whose actual aggregate emissions are less than 10 tons per year, are not required to obtain a small permit, except for synthetic minor facilities. So based on a review of emissions inventory data from these facilities, over the last 3 years, only one facility is anticipated to still need a small permit. While the remaining 17 OSWI ACI facilities appear to possibly qualify for an exemption, they may still choose to apply for and obtain a small permit. And a facility may want to hold a small permit for a variety of reasons, just as to allow growth in future operations that may result in actual emissions greater than the threshold. So due to this uncertainty, this analysis captures both scenarios, resulting in a range of estimated costs and savings. So we have a scenario where just one facility will have a small permit, and a facility where all 18 facilities have a small permit. So the fiscal impacts to the private sector and local government. And to clarify, local government, we refer to the 4 of the 18 facilities that are owned by local governments. And these impacts include savings in Title V annual permit fees, but also additional costs from new small permit fees, savings in labor for activities related to Title V permits, but also additional labor for activities related to new small permits. And then fiscal impacts to the state include reduced revenue from Title V annual permit fees, but additional revenue from new small permit fees, and savings in labor for activities related to Title V permits, additional labor for activities related to new small permits. So this table breaks down the estimated savings for the private sector, local government, and state government at a 7% discount rate in a facility where only one facility will have a small permit. So you can see total net savings for the private sector from 2025 to 2029 are $123,982 in savings. The savings for local government are $36,648 in savings. And this cost to the state government would be $22,586, resulting in a total of $138,044 in savings. And this scenario shows the scenario where 18 of the facilities would all obtain small permits. So the net savings to the private sector is $17,025. Net savings to local government is $3,041. Net cost to the state government is $70,742, resulting in a total net cost of $50,676. So the director recommends that the committee approve the proposed rule amendments to 15A NCAC 02D 1904 and 15A NCAC 02Q 810 and the accompanying fiscal note to proceed to the EMC to request approval to proceed to public comment. One more thing to note is that the effective date is different for this rule and some other rules. Pursuant to Section 10.5D of the Disaster Recovery Act, rules adopted pursuant to this section are not subject to Part 3 of Article 2A of Chapter 150B of the General Statutes, meaning Rules Review Commission Review, and shall become effective as provided in General Statute 150B 21.3B1. As though 10 or more written objections have been received as provided in General Statute 150B 21.3B2. So the rule will go to the next legislative session for review by the General Assembly, and pursuant to General Statute 150B 21.3B1, rules that go before the General Assembly will become effective on the earlier of the 31st legislative day or the day of adjournment for the next regular session of the General Assembly that begins at least 25 days after the date the Rules Review Commission approved that rule, unless a different effective date applies. So this only applies to 1904. So 1904 and 810 have two different timelines, as you'll see in the next few slides. And since 1904 won't go to the Rules Review Commission, either the first or third option will apply. So here's the schedule for 1904. And you can see between this schedule and the schedule for 810, the differences come the latter stages. Great, thank you.
Commissioner Ellison.
Excuse me, a couple questions. I think it was around slide 5 or 6, you cited an EPA study.
Yes.
Was that just an EPA study or was that some sort of EPA standard or a study that resulted in a standard?
Review, though.
Which slide are you referring
It
to?
was on the bottom of the slide. Maybe the next one. No.
Was it for the threshold, exclusionary threshold? You said 16? Oh, sorry.
It was before that because that's my next question.
Oh, I see.
There you go.
Trying to go through the regular process and be done.
So this change in the emission factor,
Yes.
was that an EPA suggestion or is you're just leveraging some EPA data to change?
We are trying to make the emission factor more relevant to how air curtain incinerators are today versus how they were in 1996. So the emission factors we're changing to are what are currently being used by permitting to issue permits for ACIs.
Okay. And then to the San Joaquin air quality, why are you using their criteria?
So that's the one that's used by the permitting department at the DAQ and other permitting, permitting from other states. And they update more updated emission factors for more modern ACIs.
Why do you rely on California's air quality districts, which are in California? I mean, why is that the source for your revision?
I think we were trying to be consistent with permitting and to represent what ACIs emit today versus in the past. So
But
why
To
specific?
be consistent with permitting in California?
No, in North Carolina. This is the permitting. These are the emission factors that the permitting for the DAQ in North Carolina use.
So
This
they
was just
were
study.
originally based on the San Joaquin Air Quality Department?
But if I could, let me ask a question here that may help clarify this, which is, used to be that EPA put out emissions factors. Now, they've quit doing that, right? And that's why we're using other sources? Or am I wrong about that?
Yes, sir. I think this is just a matter of what's the most up-to-date emission factor or set of emission factors from testing of these types of units anywhere. And so, yes, you're absolutely right. EPA used to have a pretty good catalog of those back at the time that the 810 rule was originally created, and we used that study, that 1996 study that you referenced. Now, the most up-to-date emission factor from testing is the one that Ms. De La Hunt is referencing in slide 16 from the San Joaquin Air Pollution Control District.
But we could use either one.
We would use whatever one represents the latest, greatest data from testing, based on real data from testing.
Has EPA quit updating their emission factors, or they're just slow these days, or what has happened with that system? I haven't followed that.
I'm not prepared to fully and completely answer that question.
Yeah.
I think they are infrequently updating those emission factors, but they do keep a database of test data for some source sectors. But in this case, this is the latest available state-of-the-art emission factors for this type of source.
Yes,
Is it more restrictive than the previous set of emissions factors?
It's less restrictive.
Because
Less
it's
restrictive.
probably more efficient
Yes, I think it's
air curtain incinerators than in 1996.
Yes, I think it's trying to represent how air curtain incinerators have improved, so the threshold is higher. You can burn more.
Okay. Thank you.
Right, you're going from 8,100 tons per year under the current rule
To 100.
to 76,000
Okay.
tons with this new emission factor before you get to 100 tons of a criteria pollutant.
Yes.
Okay, one last question. You mentioned that the operators are required to keep a log.
Yes.
What all goes into that log?
So I guess the specific rule text does say, but from the top of my head, they need to mention like what they're burning and how much they're burning per day.
Okay, and do they make submittals to the department?
I think it would be part of more like inspections, and they are available for reference at a given time.
Okay, thank you.
I just have one last question, which is, are you seeing a lot more use of these units in the western part of the state these days? I assume you are, but I'm just curious. Is it what?
So, yes, certainly that's been a focus with managing disaster debris in western North Carolina. And that'll be part of our division's remarks tomorrow in front of the full commission, giving an update on that.
Okay.
But certainly it's these types of units in disaster debris management situations that we would rather be used than the practice of open burning. And so,
Oh, yeah.
so yes,
question.
and so we'll talk a little bit more, Deputy Director Hartsfield will talk a little bit more about that tomorrow.
Okay.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Commissioner Bailey.
I hate to belabor this, but I got curious about this discussion. So is AP 42 still around,
That's
or
correct.
is it gone because it's now become a database?
If I may.
Go right ahead.
So
I'm not going to get into that.
It's still there, but you know, in the hierarchy of where emission factors come from, site-specific test data is always what we would prefer, right? For individual permitting situation, or or emission factors derived from test data at a similar facility elsewhere, doesn't matter where, such that we can review that test. And then you kind of get down the hierarchy down to AP 42's kind of last resort when you don't have any other thing based on recent test data. It's still a resource.
So you still go to EPA though to find the most recent one, and right, EPA still is the one in control of, you're not trying to search every state database. As a state agency, you're going to go to a central source to find the latest studies.
Right, and most often when this comes up is in context of a permitting decision. So we get a permit application and the applicant's using a variety of emission factors. And again, the hierarchy is as I explained. And if it's the applicant's using test data from a similar facility and name a state, we're going to ask to see that data.
Okay,
in
I
that
get
test
you.
report.
Okay, I
That
understand.
supports that emission factor, but very common in our permitting practices.
Thank you.
Any more questions, discussion? If not, I would entertain a motion to approve the recommendation here to go to the commission and put this rule and the fiscal note out for public notice and hearing. Anyone have a motion?
Commissioner Bailey,
Okay, Commissioner
I
Bailey.
might as well get in on every motion today. So
That's
I so
fine.
move.
We appreciate you being so active. And a second? Second from Commissioner Ellison. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Just
Whoops.
one
Oh,
more
I'm sorry.
Abstention, please. On the vote.
Okay. Note that Commissioner Duggan is abstaining from the vote, but otherwise we have a unanimous vote, and this will go forward to the commission at the May meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And let's move on to, where's my agenda? Okay, the request for approval to proceed to the commission on having comment on the agency determination reports for periodic review of rules in 2D and 2Q. And Joelle Burleson will present.
Good morning, Commissioners. Thank you for the chance to be before you today. This is a process that I think you're all very familiar with at this point, so I'll try not to belabor too many points here. Let's see if I can get the slides going. As Commissioner Carter said, I am Joelle Burleson. I'm with the planning section here in the Division of Air Quality. And here we have just a few acronyms for your reference, should they be needed, or for the reference of the public if they happen to be viewing the slides. The periodic review of existing rules is required by GS 150B 21.3A. And under this requirement, y'all have to review, as does every other state agency, all their rules every 10 years. The rules were last reviewed by this body in 2015 timeframe in terms of the report itself. And as you know, you have to establish whether the rules are necessary or unnecessary. In the first round of rules review and readoption, the rules were determined necessary or readopted by the EMC between 2017 and July of 2020. So basically, OAH has arranged this into three basic steps. The agency, which is you, the EMC's review, where you prepare the initial determination report that classifies rules as necessary or unnecessary, hold a minimum of a 60-day public comment period on those determinations, and then submit a final agency report that includes your responses to comments and the determinations to the Rules Review Commission. The second step is for the Rules Review Commission to make their review of our reports and comments, and then prepare a few more columns in the spreadsheet that it makes up the report, and submit that to the Joint Legislative Administrative Procedures Oversight Committee of the General Assembly. And then the third and final step is the Administrative Procedure Oversight Committee's review. They have a 60-day opportunity to review the final determination report that's forwarded to them from RRC before it actually becomes effective. So for your air quality rules, you currently have 314 air quality rules in the North Carolina Administrative Code. They're found in 15A NCAC O2D, which houses the air pollution control requirements. There are 225 rules there. In 15A NCAC O2Q, we have our air quality permits procedures where there are 89 rules. And these subchapters are interrelated. The rules cross-reference one another throughout. The majority of the rules in these air quality sections are federally required or approved under various provisions of the Clean Air Act. For example, some are approved under the Clean Air Act Section 110 State Implementation Plan or SIP provisions. Some are approved as part of the Section 111D emission guidelines provisions or under the Title V permitting program, and then other authorities specific to particular rules. Identification of a rule as federally required does not mean that it can't be repealed as part of the readoption process. However, since some of these are federally required, it may require an additional step on the part of DAQ to perhaps do a demonstration of non-interference with maintenance or attainment of a standard if a NAAQS is involved in that particular rule's purpose. So currently, the existing rules that are included in the report are 225 rules in subchapter O2D and 88 rules in the air quality permits procedures. And so that's only a total of 313. That's because OAH has set a cutoff date of January 1, 2024 as rules that are subject to this round of review. We just recently had O2D 410 approved at the January EMC and subsequently at the February RRC, and it became effective March 1st. So that effective date is reflected in the report. You have amendments before you tomorrow that may become effective before we actually take this report out to public notice, before you as a full commission might approve the reports. So before that happens, we would want to update those dates, effective dates in the spreadsheets that are before you. I would note there is one rule, 2Q529, that was adopted by you in November and became effective January 1st of this year. And so it is not included in the report. So the reports that are before you classify all of the rules as necessary. The 225 in O2D and the 88 in O2Q. Necessary means any rule other than an unnecessary rule, per OAH's definition. And unnecessary means a rule that the agency determines to be obsolete, redundant, or otherwise not needed. So our timeline, we're at the very beginning with you all for our reports. And here we have before you those initial determination reports and a request to proceed to the EMC. We would anticipate, should you approve these reports today, that we would come to the EMC in May, hold a public comment period in the May, June, July timeframe, then take the reports and responses to comments back to you. Following that, in the September timeframe, submit a final report to OAH and the RRC by their November 20th deadline in order to meet the required rules review commission meeting in December 18th and complete our first phase of this process. And then back in early 2026, we would anticipate reports having been reviewed by APO and the final reports actually becoming effective. And then we would move on to the next phase of readoption in 2026, where we consult or receive consultation requests from the Rules Review Commission and work with them to establish a readoption deadline for all of the rules. We're now required, unlike the first round, to provide a timeline, which you're familiar with, for readoption by the EMC. And we have to provide that within the later of 60 days of receipt of consultation request from our RC, or 10 days after the next regularly scheduled EMC meeting after receipt. So we would then follow through the process to see what readoption deadline our RC finally decides on and establishes for us. And then we would be back to you many times after that to complete rulemaking, to re-adopt and submit the rules to OAH by whatever that final deadline is. So the request that I have for you today is that the director recommends approval to proceed to the EMC to request to proceed to public comment with the periodic review of existing rules, initial determination reports for 15A, NCAC, O2D, and O2Q.
I just have one question here because maybe my memory's gotten real poor here, which is not unlikely, but I don't remember this additional process through the Joint Legislative Administrative Procedure Oversight Committee. Is that new or different than we've done in the past? I thought we
No,
we
sir.
did the readoption and it went to RRC and up or down at RRC and that was it.
No, sir. They also submitted last go round. RRC makes that final step and they submit the final reports to the Joint Legislative Administrative Procedures Oversight Committee. And then they may or may not
Yeah.
take it up actively. They may simply list it as one among many reports as they did last time that has been approved. Or they may let the time frame go by and then the 61st day after they would,
So
the
once-
reports would in effect.
Once the 61st day runs, it's effectively
Yes, sir.
goes forward anyway. Okay, that's fine. Anyone else have any questions, comments, concerns? All right, then I would entertain a motion to move this forward to the EMC at the May meeting. Moved by Commissioner Duggan, second.
Second.
I second.
Ah,
Commissioner
Commissioner
Smith
Williams
seconds.
is helping us out here today. Thank you very much. Any discussion, comments? All right, then all in favor, please say aye. Any opposed? None opposed, it passes unanimously. Mr. Chairman, we're trying to load up your May agenda.
Thank you.
All right.
We'll be busy.
Okay. Next is the overview of the exceptional events demonstration for the revised PM 2.5 NACS. Sarah is going to give us the report on this. Unfortunately, I've had to defer her at least once, or has it been twice now? Okay, so we're actually going to get to her presentation today, which is good. And yeah, we're okay on time. We'll wait and do the order after.
All right. All right. Good morning, commissioners. Thank you for having me. I'm Sarah Kreuzer. I'm a meteorologist within DAQ's attainment planning branch. Today, we are talking about North Carolina's exceptional events demonstration, but we can't really do that without briefly touching on why we submitted this document. This document is in support of our designation recommendations that we were required to submit to the EPA following the promulgation of the primary annual PM 2.5 standard. That was strengthened from 12 down to 9.0 micrograms per cubic meter. And this is just a simple flow chart that shows that those two documents, the EE demo and the designation recommendation, will be taken into account by the EPA when they promulgate their final area designations for the revised standard. We submitted our designation recommendation at the end of last year. That document is linked here. We recommended that the EPA designate all 100 North Carolina counties as in attainment with the revised standard, and that's based on the certified monitoring data for 2021 through 2023, which is the most recent 3-year design value period. We also submitted an exceptional events demonstration on February 6th of this year, and that supports that designation recommendation. And that link is also on this slide. That document focuses on 2 monitors, the Remount monitor in Mecklenburg County and the Lexington monitor in Davidson County. And the document requests exclusion of certain days that were impacted by smoke from the 2023 Canadian wildfire season. Those 2 monitors have design values of 9.2 micrograms per cubic meter, so slightly above that revised standard. And we carefully followed EPA's exceptional events rule and their supporting guidance documents and used a variety of evidence to show that that was the case. You may have seen this map presented before, but it shows all of our PM 2.5 monitors across the state. Most of them are green, which means they are below the revised standard. The two that are yellow are the Remount and Lexington monitors. We do not have any monitors violating the standard outright without an influence from an exceptional event. And so now to quickly revisit what happened in 2023, this graph shows the total area burned in Canada each year from 1983 through 2024. The solid black line on the bottom shows the annual average of 2.5 million hectares burned. The small black line in the upper right-hand corner shows 17.3 million hectares burned in 2023, which more than doubled the previous record. And looking back, there are a few important things to note about this time period that can help us understand how things evolved the way that they did. This graph is showing the upper atmospheric pattern in early June of 2023. It's showing anomalous pressure compared to climatology. And so there was a strong area of high pressure that set up over Canada, which is denoted by the red and orange and yellow area. This was accompanied by an area of low pressure that set up over the East Coast, denoted by the purple and blue area. Persistent high pressure led to hot, dry conditions and drought, and that contributed to an early start to Canada's wildfire season. The clockwise rotation around the high and the counterclockwise rotation around the low funneled cool Canadian air down over the East Coast, and it also funneled smoke, a lot of smoke. This is a screenshot from our ambient information reporter tool, which shows not only our current and past air quality data, but also satellite detected fire and smoke. So you can see how that smoke from up in Canada was funneled in between those atmospheric features over the East Coast. And this is a screenshot from June 7th, 2023. So switching gears a bit now, we're going to talk about the demonstration requirements. So the EPA defines an exceptional event as an unusual or naturally occurring event that can affect air quality, but is not reasonably controllable using techniques that tribal, state, or local air agencies may implement in order to attain and maintain the NAAQS. And this is a list of those types of qualifying events. The exceptional event rule allows for the exclusion of data influenced by exceptional events from use in actions with regulatory significance. So we show in the demonstration that the record-breaking Canadian wildfire season in 2023 did have regulatory significance for us by impacting the design values at Remount and Lexington. This is a quick summary of our process for analyzing our data and determining the wildfire's impacts. We retrieved daily average concentration data for both monitors from 2021 to 2023. Again, that's the most recent certified design value period. Then we sorted them highest to lowest and focused on the top 20 days just as a starting point for our analysis. We used archived meteorological data, our air tool, which shows past air quality data and fire and smoke layers, as well as media reports if necessary to assess what happened on those days for the highest concentration in order to identify which of those days were influenced by the Canadian wildfires. And the big question we were aiming to answer was, I'm sorry, I skipped ahead a bit there. So what we did once we identified those days was we systematically removed them from the data set and recalculated a new 2021 to 2023 design value. And the big question was, would we be in attainment if we could exclude those days? And the answer was yes. So we identified 4 multi-day episodes, which was 14 days in total, in 2023 that impacted both the monitors and resulted in some of the highest daily average concentrations that were measured during the 3-year design value period. And all of those events were in June and July. For each event, DAQ is required to provide data and sound reasoning for each exceptional day, and the EPA would review the specifics of each day using a tiered weight of evidence approach. The tiering thresholds are unique to each monitor and each month because they're based on a statistical analysis of the past 5 years of data, so 2018 through 2023. Basically, in a nutshell, what the EPA's tiering tool is doing is establishing a common procedure to determine just how exceptional a day is or how anomalous a day is compared to a historical average. So this is a screenshot from their online public-facing tool for the Lexington monitor, I believe. And all of the red dots you see are daily averages that are tier 1. So those are very anomalous. They don't require as much evidence because of that. The yellow dots are tier 2 days. Those require a bit more data to sort of tell our story. And then the tier 3 days are the blue dots. So that's the majority of the data at that monitor. That is the hardest story to tell or, point to prove that those were exceptional. And so all the days that we identified for both monitors were tier 1 and tier 2 days. So jumping into the components of the demonstration, first we needed to provide a narrative conceptual model. And that's basically a high-level summary of the wildfire season, the anomalous weather pattern, which was the steering mechanism for the smoke. And so for that, for each of our events, we, for example, provided these pictures that were provided from the National Park Service. This is taken from Purchase Knob, looking northeast. On the right is a very smoky day. You can obviously see the haze. This is from July 17th, 2023. And then we compared that to a typical day. So on the left side, that's from June 10th of last year. The narrative conceptual model is really mostly comprised of what we already just talked about. So here I've included some synced animations to show you that upper atmospheric pattern during one of the events with the smoke and fire layers on the right side. So you can see how the smoke wrapped around that low, the purple and blue, and how it's digging across the eastern United States and how it kind of pulls that smoke over. So that's the type of thing that we provided in the demonstration for that section. The bulk of the demonstration is the clear causal relationship and the historical data analysis portion. Here we provide a detailed description of each event, including satellite imagery of the smoke, back trajectories which show where our source air mass was, surface analysis, so showing fronts that come through, for example, and then of course our hourly observations. So the critical thing in this section was for us to show that not only was there smoke aloft, but that it reached the surface and directly impacted our monitors. And for the tier 2 days, we had to provide more data to add to the weight of evidence. For that, we included things like other smoke and aerosol models that are available, visibility reports from airports, as well as radio sonde soundings, which are from weather balloons, to show instances when temperature inversions set up, which acted to trap the pollution at the surface. So that was the case for a few of the days. After that, the next requirement was to show that the emissions were not reasonably controllable or preventable. We utilized this section of the EE rule that states that a state does not have to provide case-specific justification if the emissions generating activity occurs outside of our jurisdictional boundaries. So basically, since the fires originated in Canada, there was no regulatory action or policy that we could have implemented to prevent that smoke from crossing international boundaries. So that criterion was met. The next one was to show that this was a natural event or a human activity unlikely to recur. We showed that by using the EPA's definition of a wildfire, which the last part there says a wildfire that predominantly occurs on wildland is a natural event. So since they were unplanned, mostly lightning ignited fires predominantly on wildland, that criteria was met. And then the last requirement is to show that we anticipated these exceptional events. We alerted the public and we educated the public about how to mitigate any negative health effects from the incoming particle pollution. And in North Carolina, we have a pretty robust communication system set up. We have daily forecast discussions online that the public can read. We have social media on X and Facebook where we post our forecasts. We also utilize press releases as well as media interviews to get that information out. And so we provided this type of information for each of those days or events that we identified. The EE rule also requires a public comment period. We held this from November 20th through December 20th last year. We did not receive a request for a public hearing. We did receive 4 comments, 1 from a private citizen, 2 from business or industry organizations, and 1 from an environmental organization. And all of those comments and our responses to the comments that dispute or contradict the factual evidence that we provided are included in an appendix of the final demonstration. Okay, only a few slides left here. This is a table that shows the milestones that we've achieved so far, highlighted in green. Where we're at right now is we have submitted both our designation recommendation and our EE demo, so we're just waiting to hear back from them on that. It's under review. If the EPA decides to make any modifications to our recommendations, they would notify us of that. There would be a 30-day comment period, and then there would be some back and forth communication in that case. But the EPA will promulgate their final area designations next February, on February 6th. And then I'll wrap up with just some key takeaways. North Carolina generally has excellent air quality. We've been in attainment with all the national standards since 2015. But sometimes events outside our control can impact air quality to such an extent that it skews the design value of a monitor. And those 2023 Canadian wildfire smoke intrusions did have a significant regulatory implication for us. We've worked closely with the EPA's Region 4 team throughout the whole process, from our initial notification to let them know that we were planning to submit a demo, to working through drafts and working through some of the comment responses. And so we'll continue to do that when we need to. And then something important I wanted to point out was that if our demonstration is concurred upon by the EPA, the data is not deleted from the record. It's not removed from the database. It's just flagged in a certain way so that it doesn't count against us in regulatory decisions regarding attainment.
Cool.
Okay.
Nice.
Probably not.
Where did that thing come from, the balloon?
It's just been hovering up in the ceiling.
Okay, right before my last point.
Yeah, all right.
Which was simply
I guess
that
we're not gonna be using the balloons today, I mean, the fans today. No. What the hell's breaking over there? Holy cow.
I was so close to being done. Okay. So the last point was just, again, to say that we've recommended statewide attainment for the revised standard, which is supported by the EE demo that we've also submitted. So that's it. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions.
All right, Commissioner Allison.
Was that caused by Canadian Air Max. You cited that you use media reports at the beginning, and could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, so there's a section of the rule that says, you have to kind of show that you did anticipate this was happening, it was going to come, because, we're forecasters, we're looking ahead, we want to make sure that the public knows what's about to occur. And so one of the ways that we do that is by press releases. And when we do that, the media, it gets their attention. So either before or during these events, we would occasionally have reporters from various news media just calling to ask questions about, what can we expect here in North Carolina? What are the impacts? And so by including screenshots and, some links to some of those media reports, it just adds to the weight of evidence that these were unusual things that occurred.
And from the recent fires around Myrtle Beach, were the air patterns setting up to give us more smoke? Or is that not an issue this time?
It doesn't appear to be. I think I'll say our monitors were okay. I think they definitely had some moderate readings, which is code yellow, which is below the daily standard. So yeah, that doesn't appear to be an issue at this time.
Okay, and last question, what was the level of effort to develop this work for EPA approximately?
I believe we started this around September of last year. There's a team of 3 of us that kind of split up the bulk of the report. So it was definitely a team effort. And I would say it took us a couple months to get this report drafted up. And then there was, some back and forth reviewing and the public comment period, and then addressing the comments. So we submitted this in February. So, it was, from probably September through February was really the main focus of our work was this.
And I don't mean to put you on the spot too much. Was this 1,000 man-hour task, or were you spending 10% of your time on it, or was this a real time sink?
That's a good question. I would say, certainly none of us were working overtime to get this done. We could handle this during our normal working hours. It kind of ebbed and flowed as well, but during the beginning of it, it was, it was fully our all-day attention was getting this report written, maybe for a couple weeks or so. And then after that, it was kind of, back and forth review, touching up a few sections here and there, adding things. So it kind of, tapered off a bit at the end. But
the reason I'm asking is it seems all pretty clear cut, right? The woods are burning in Canada and we have smoke in the air. It just seems like an awful lot of effort by the department to get this EPA report in there to prove that it wasn't our fault. Okay, thank you.
thank you.
Well, I looked at one question. I'm not sure about the extent up here, but I think I heard over the weekend or late last week that there's something like, maybe the number that comes to mind is 168 separate fires in South Carolina going on last week, in the last couple of weeks. Is that? And I don't think it was a comparable number, but a large number in North Carolina as well. Was it just because we're dry in both places? What the heck's going on?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of the fact that we are in a drought. And there is a lot of, debris from Hurricane Helene in North Carolina. We've also just had a lot of dry, windy weather, and it's also, prescribed an agricultural burning season. So not only are, people trying to stay ahead of things by doing prescriptive burning, there's also, small and large wildfires occurring. So it's a combination of all that.
Well, are they generally under control now, including up here, or do we know?
I think generally, yes. At least the last couple of days I've been watching things, it seems there's still, prescribed burning happening and things like that, because it's just that time of year. But I don't think that currently there's any large wildfires, at least in North Carolina.
hopefully the prescribed burning is being done much more carefully. Okay, anyone else have any questions or Sarah? All right. Okay,
Thank you.
then, let's see here. Where's my agenda? Okay, and the last item here, at least on the informational side, before we get to director's remarks, is the, an update on the pre-permitting provisions of this North Carolina, well, I'm not going to go through that, through the session law. Now, to take you back at least a couple of meetings, if you may or may not recall, I guess it came up in November. The division had sent a letter to EPA requesting parallel processing for these changes. And I sent that, I think that was sent around September 1st, give or take. And then at the end of the month, EPA sent back a letter saying, nope, you can't do that because that could create emission standard violations and interference with the NACs, both of which I considered silly because it didn't really correspond to what we were proposing, what this statute proposed to change. In particular, because the changes we're talking about here are operational. They are, the statute allows certain construction activities once a completed permit application has been delivered to the division, but it does not in any way allow anyone to initiate operation until they've actually received a permit. So on the face of it, this the EPA letter was, I thought, rather silly because it didn't comport with the reality of the situation. But where we find ourselves now is this: there are two session laws involved in here. They're listed on the agenda. The second session law last fall directed directed a July 1, 2025 deadline to get something submitted. And so we don't have enough time, even if we wanted to at this point, to conduct a full-blown rulemaking and get that done by July 1. That's quite clear. What the department has proposed, and I've discussed with the council and so on, is to send EPA a new letter and say, look, here's the situation. It lays it out in some detail. The letter is attached to the agenda. I recommend that you all take a look at it. And we know that if nothing else, we've got a change of administration not only nationally, but we also, surprising to me, we also already have a new regional administrator appointed. That, to me, I don't know if that's ever happened in history, that our regional administrator's gotten appointed quite this quickly. I mean, ordinarily, regional administrators that drags on for months, if not some cases even years before someone's appointed after a new administration comes in. So that's very helpful, I think, that we've got management down there and new management, and hopefully we'll get a new and very different response this time. What the letter basically does is request EPA to sign off on these changes. Now, and we're actually, the idea is, of course, this would become part of the state implementation plan. I will say right up front, I'm not real clear on this letter process approval and how that in effect modifies the federally approved SIP. I've been doing this for a lot of years and I don't remember ever seeing anything like that as far as a formal approval or a formal amendment to a SIP. I'm not going to tell you it can't be done. I'm not going to tell you it's never been done. I just have never seen it. So I'm a little skeptical as to where we're going to actually be at the end of this process. But I think it needs to go forward. We at least need to get, hopefully, a sign off from EPA, and we can sort this out. The other aspect of this I wanted to comment on too is that one of the things about this, these rule change or these changes, I'm not going to call them rule changes at this point since we're not doing rulemaking, but the changes are very prescriptive. They set out in very great detail exactly what facilities would be allowed to do at their own risk. And keep in mind, they're not guaranteed they're going to get a permit just because they have an administratively complete application at DAQ. So if somebody decides they want to go ahead, they've got a timeline problem, they got a financing problem, whatever it may be, and do some or all of these authorized construction activities, it's completely at their own risk. But what I'm coming around to is one of the things that we don't do typically is if we have something, at least is this prescriptive in the statute, we don't simply take that statute and write it into rule. We provide, that's, I don't know if there's any prescription on it per se, but I know that's at least been the practice. So at the end of the day, I've got at least these two questions about this whole process. But if we can get approval and sign off from EPA here in the near term, the provisos are in the rule, or excuse me, in the statute, and anyone who wants to take advantage of them can then go look at the statute and decide whether they want to do something or not. But I think certainly the next, the right step now is to send this letter forward. But I wanted everybody to take a look at it and see if there are any further questions, thoughts, comments, whatever it is. And I would intend also to take a committee vote, at least on approval of the letter, if we are inclined to do so. And then the question is going to be for our chairman, whether he thinks this is something that we also should review tomorrow at the full commission, add it to the agenda and review it tomorrow and have an up or down at the full commission. So we're in kind of, well, pretty much uncharted waters here, unless you remember something that I don't remember when, prior commission actions, and certainly something like this with a letter request to EPA to approve a SIP change. Or SIP approval, I guess, yeah.
So I would agree with that. I don't know of any previous approach to a SIP amendment in this fashion. I don't think this would constitute a request for a SIP amendment. So there are several layers to this. One, we talked about at the time, this concept rule, which turned out to be a draft rule, was submitted to EPA, which is that all of the language is in the statute.
Right.
And in fact, there is a prescription against administrative agencies adopting verbatim, essentially, statutory provisions. We are not allowed to do that under the Administrative Procedures Act. There's no reason to do that under the Administrative Procedures Act. So, and my understanding of the session law was that the intent of the session law was to have the department get some preliminary reaction from EPA to a rule that reflected what was in the statute. And we had the discussion at the time about, my feeling at the time was we should have sent EPA the statutory language as opposed to doing a rule draft, but whatever. But the intent of the legislation, as I understood it, was to get some preliminary EPA reaction to the statutory language and determine how strong EPA's reaction, objection to that would be. Right. Given that that was the intent, as I understand it, of the session law or the legislation, my feeling at this stage is there's nothing more for the department or the EMC to do except to communicate back to the legislature what EPA's response was. And then the legislature can decide whether they want to change the language they put in the statute or not. But I don't see an action for this commission to take. We cannot and should not adopt a rule that's verbatim repetition of the statute. This is not a request for a SIP amendment. The SIP amendment would have to be based on the statute language. And the whole project, as I understand it, was to get some feedback from EPA for the legislature with respect to the effect of the legislative language. We ought to communicate that if it hasn't been communicated already, and let the legislature decide whether they want to change the statutory language or not.
Well, I appreciate you reminding me this in the APA, but I guess I don't agree with you because one thing the letter last September did not do was what you just described, to provide the legislative language, or at least in the text of the letter itself, the legislative language. That's what this letter will do. And given the change of leadership at EPA, I don't see any reason why we shouldn't renew or request for, well, hopefully a sign off by EPA at this point. I don't see any reason not to do that. And certainly that's where the department is proposing at this point. Anyone else have any thoughts, suggestions, concerns?
Just so
Commissioner Duggan.
Is this, and sorry, I should have asked for.
No, you're good.
Is this letter simply requesting that the EPA amend our SIP to add the statutory language?
I'm gonna have you comment on this. That's, I don't think that's quite my understanding of it, although I'll admit there's at least some ambiguity here, but I think at this point, we're at least asking them to sign off on the statutory languages that at least they don't have any objection to it. Now, as far as the formal process, and I agree with Commissioner Smith on this, I'm not sure how you'd actually formally change or formally approve a SIP change by letter. And that's where my big question mark is in this whole thing. So, but I think that if we can get a different, I'll get the folks to re-review in Atlanta and get a sign off down there, that's at least what would be reporting to the folks up the mall here. And then if they want to suggest something different, they can do it, I suppose, but.
Yeah, and I'll just
Yeah,
follow
sure.
up, I guess, in response to Mr. Duggan's question. As I read the letter, it is not actually a request for amendment of the SIP. It says in the last paragraph that there is intent to submit a final version as an amendment to the SIP. So I agree with the chair. I think the letter seems to be having another go at EPA to get some reaction, this time using a copy of the statute as opposed to a rule that repeats the statute, which I think is where we should have started to begin with, but that's another issue. And then see what EPA has to say about that. But whatever EPA says about that, the SIP's not going to change until we do a formal request for amendment of the SIP based on that statute language.
Yeah, I think you and I are in full agreement there. I guess, although obviously we wouldn't, for the reasons you've already described, we wouldn't go back or wouldn't go out with a rule that just recites the language in the statute. That's prohibited anyway. I suppose maybe the right answer is assuming that EPA is agreeable to the statutory provisos here, that perhaps what we would simply do is send them, I guess, a request, or maybe we'd call it a rule. We'd have to call it a rule, I guess, that simply requested them to approve the changes and cite the session law, and that's it. Don't put any language in it. Don't put any details in it. It simply says, approve this as a change to our SIP. And other than that, I don't really see a way to do this sort of through the normal rulemaking process. Now, that reminds me of one other question. You triggered something else. The one thing that is in that letter that I was scratching my head over a little bit too is that it proposes to go to public notice on this and seek comments and then send EPA something back after that process is completed. I guess, but my thought was, what would we be sending back other than the session law? I mean, other than, I guess you could send them a summary of comments, but we can't make any changes based on public comment. That's because the statute is the statute. So I wasn't real clear what your intention was with respect to that part of the letter. If you have any, you can add a further thought on that.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, and just to kind of rewind a moment, and I'll come back to that. What we've attempted to do here was in response to the questions and concerns that arose during your November committee meeting related to the process of the division preparing and submitting to EPA for approval a proposed state implementation plan or SIP amendment. And so we took those committee questions and comments back, and we worked with additional input from legal counsel, just as the committee had suggested, and then came up with this additional plan of an additional submittal of these pre-permitting session law provisions to EPA. And so specifically, the letter contains the session law language. So it's cutting and pasting language. It's not giving them the session law or asking them to review and approve the session law by reference into the SIP, but it's taking the text from the session law. But the letter here is initiating a 30-day public process, because in order to properly get a SIP amendment request before EPA, part of that process must include a public process. And so this letter is worded as such to inform everyone, including EPA, that we are going to take this text that we're cutting and pasting into the letter out for 30-day public comment. The public comment period schedule allows for anyone to request a public hearing, allows DAQ to address those comments, and then submit the final session law language in a letter to EPA by the July 2025 deadline as prescribed in 2024-1. And so we're poised to make that happen.
Okay.
And follow that process. And then to some of the earlier points, to try to just find an analogous type of situation where we've submitted something like this before. We went back and found an example or two. One big one that came to mind was related to the Clean Smokestacks Act, which was passed into law in 2002, very important legislation in the history of our air quality in the state. We requested the EPA include the system-wide caps that were included in that law into the SIP because they were an important and foundational piece to a lot of the state air plans we were developing at the time related to attainment of ozone and fine particulate standards. And so it was important that those caps be part of our federally approved control program in the SIP. And so by letter, we asked EPA at that time to approve those emissions caps. So not the full statute,
Right.
not by reference, but the specific numbers that Duke had to comply with system-wide for NOx and SO2. And so we did that back in 2009, and EPA ultimately approved that into our SIP at some point after 2009. So that was the kind of closest
Well,
analogy, I think, that we could come up with here, but I thought I'd just share that for purposes of discussion here today.
well, I
But
appreciate that. I'm glad you found that. Well, let me just ask you one more question about that. So, did that process, was that process that they were following there, essentially identical to this? I mean, that is, you requested that those caps be included in the SIP, and did they approve that simply based on a letter request, or was there some further rulemaking process that followed?
it was somewhat tethered to our attainment demonstration for, at that time, what the fine particle standards were. And so it was our attainment demonstration that had gone through a full public process that included those system-wide emission caps.
Okay.
So that all went through a public process. That draft SIP or attainment demonstration for particular areas of the state showing how we were going to attain the fine particle standards back then. And so, yeah, all of that went through a public process, ultimately was submitted together as a package to EPA.
Right.
And then they approved it into the SIP.
So, but that was a full-blown rulemaking. But did they take, it was not?
No, sir. That was an attainment demonstration for PM 2.5 attainment across the state. And then also the system-wide caps were attached to that SIP amendment request.
But the attainment demonstration didn't go through rulemaking?
No, sir. No, sir.
Mr. Chairman,
Yeah. go
there
ahead.
was also rulemaking, however, related to the Clean Smokestacks Act. And I don't remember
was
if
thinking,
the caps were included in the rule. I haven't looked back at that in a long time, but there was actually rulemaking to implement the Clean Smokestacks Act as well.
So,
Chair Solomon.
so this next round of letters, is it purely to comply with the SIP amendment by middle of July, whatever date that is,
July
July
1.
1st? Is that why we're writing a letter?
Yes,
We've
sir.
already written one letter.
We've written one letter that was a parallel processing request prior to going through a public process. This one will go through a public process, as I explained, and submitted officially to EPA, and we can accomplish all of that prior to July 1.
So I think this, if we want to write the letter, if this committee wants to write the letter, it should be probably, regardless who writes it, a joint letter with everybody's endorsement is what we want to try. But eyes wide open to the people that sponsored it. This has got a low likelihood of coming back anywhere close to July 1, right? If that's the case, then I think we owe it to the people at General Assembly to say, we got the letter back. This is not how things are done. We've got to come up with our own language. We've got to come up with a SIP amendment, which would be a rulemaking process. And that, sorry, we're not going to make July 1 because we need to start a rulemaking progress. I had rather, if we need a rulemaking, if that's what this body decides we need, let's get on with the rulemaking and try to get it by the end of this calendar year and get that to EPA versus getting a letter to EPA where they're probably going to tell us what we already know. You can't just take language out of the General Assembly without a public process. Y'all have to decide that for me. I don't know the air world as well as some of you guys know it, but if the probability is low, then let's not waste everybody's time by writing another letter on a very low probability, at least without the General Assembly, the bill sponsors knowing what the odds are and what we would propose as counter. That would be my take. I'll do whatever you guys want as a committee. But if we decide to take the chance, it seems like under consultation with the EMC or something, that the EMC feel good about this and the department feel good about this.
What, Commissioner Duggan?
Yeah, has there been any conversation with the legislature about revising this arbitrary deadline?
Not that I'm aware of, unless somebody at the department is. I kind of doubt it at this point. Well, look, we need to finish up. And all right, Chair Smith.
Just one more quick
Commissioner Smith.
question. So was there a report back to the legislature, whichever oversight committee was involved? I don't remember the language of the legislation. Was there a report back to the legislature on the content of the first EPA response? Because that entire process was intended to provide feedback to the legislature on the potential for EPA approval of the language as it stood at that time.
I'm not aware of that circle back occurring.
Let's make that, then. I'm just speaking for me. You decide as the chair in this committee, but for me, from the EMC, that makes the most sense to me is to explain to the sponsors, oversight committee, whoever, these are the odds and this is where it sits. I think that conversation needs to be had first before we go off writing more letters. To me.
Well, I mean,
But
I
that's
think we
your-
could have that. I don't see any reason we couldn't have that in parallel. I'm at least at this point, I'm inclined to go with the department's recommendation on this. Go ahead and send the letter. I'm not going to try to guess the probabilities. As I said, we've got, different management down there. They may see it the same. They may see it differently. But I think at least it follows really the track that Commissioner Smith was talking about, that we've laid out exactly what the changes in the statute are. That the legislature adopted, and see what kind of reaction we get back. Now, I guess we can, and go ahead with if we go ahead with the 30-day process, we can get some other input and would make sense, of course, at that point, if we're doing this, that the legislature, or at least the staff over there, somebody ought to be apprised of the process that we're going forward with, and make it clear that it is being done this way as a result of the July 1 deadline in the statute, and they were trying to meet that specification they put in last fall. But I understand your skepticism, Mr. Chair. And then see what happens. I mean, as I said, it may be, the end point is just a simple rule at some point to formalize this thing. But at least we would have the benefit. Well, no, either way. If EPA says no again, at that point, we would at least need to, certainly need to go back to the legislature and let them know that, ask them if they really want us to keep fighting this battle and send a rule down that is going to get disapproved. So that's why I'm inclined to go ahead and do this and see where we stand now with EPA. So, Mr. Chair.
I was just going to say, I think what the EPA is going to tell us, not just we can't use statutory language, but they've told us this on another issue recently. They're not going to respond to a letter if that's not what they're inclined to do. They want to see the rule and they'll give an opinion on the rule. And by the time we go through this process, we've already lost time where we could adopt a new rule if we wanted to, or modified rule. So they may shoot down later, but to think that in a few months, a new administration is going to have at that lower level a different reading than the first one did, I just don't think so. Maybe in 6 months, they'll be able to react to the rule, but everything's in flux there too right now. So I'll go either way, guys, but just I don't want to waste anybody's time.
You want to, well, I was just going to suggest, we could certainly be, once this letter is sent, if we send it, we can, GAQ can certainly be in contact with folks down there and just see, get some reading. And it may be that between now and the May meeting, we may decide maybe we ought to crank up and put a rule together to deal with at the May meeting to try to, expedite as you have suggested. The other thing is if this goes, we get on out for 30-day comment period here, we'll have some feedback there as well. So it seems to me this process is, it ain't great. Let me be dead honest about this thing. I mean, we're in a strange, very strange position. But it seems like from where we stand right now, I'm like I say, I'm inclined to go ahead with the letter, push forward and see if we can get this thing squared away as soon as possible. Chairman Bailey, Commissioner Bailey.
Thank you for calling me chairman. I'm honored. But
I thought you'd appreciate that.
yes, thank you so much. Anyway, I am interested in having the legislature get an update on this. And well, I haven't been someone who lobbied the legislature since like a long, long time ago. I thought there was an environmental review committee of the legislature that reviewed certain environmental issues, and maybe the name has changed over the years, but I used to attend those meetings on behalf of a client when I worked at a law firm. And so, I mean, of course, there's the bill sponsors, but I guess I'd like to have us reach out to someone, or that department reach out to someone and figure out an update so they know what we're doing. Because if we do want an extension of time, usually you like to give someone some warning ahead of time and give them some progress reports on what's going on so they know you've done something. And so if we do want an extension from July, then we've already laid the groundwork for it. I don't know who exactly it goes to, but it seems like there would be some legislative committee and the bill sponsors.
Well, I certainly agree with you, particularly on going ahead and contacting them. If I didn't say that before, that is certainly one thing we should do is to, however we move forward, and assuming we are going to go forward with the letter, certainly make the legislature aware that I think you're referring to the Environmental Review Commission. My best recollection is that I'm not sure they meet during the session. I think they may only meet between sessions, but I'm not sure that's the right group for this anyway. I think whoever the legislators are that are most involved, the legislative, there's got to be an environment committee. I don't follow the legislature closely myself, but at least, and the departments, got contacts and liaison over there. They can certainly make them aware of what's going on. But I think that's well taken, and we certainly need to give them an update at this point. Whether or not they heard or were fully aware of what happened back in September or not, we certainly need to apprise them now of exactly where things stand. And I guess I'll call them potential difficulties of meeting the July 1 deadline, and that we may, the department may need to request a modification of that deadline if it proves necessary. Mr. Chair, Mr. You.
Director, a lot of people today.
Yeah, sorry. I'm making everybody a chair.
Thank you. Just two quick points, because I think we understand where we're at here. Just to speak to the process that we're discussing here today about this letter. EPA is aware. We have consulted with them on this process. We wouldn't have brought this forward today had we not consulted with EPA and understood that this is a viable pathway. And then two, taking this pathway and getting this letter out and doing the 30-day comment process and then officially submitted to EPA is something that we will easily meet the deadline with this pathway.
Right.
And so there are no concerns about meeting July 1, 2025 and what the department is instructed to do in the session law. So I just wanted to share that with you. In fact, I believe that we will have this entire process complete prior to when we meet again. It's very possible. And so
that would be the best.
So that is, from a timing perspective, how I view it at this point. And I'm prepared to sign this letter this week, initiating that public comment process. And then after that's over, proceeding with the submittal to EPA, having gone through that proper public process.
Right. One question, you said that you had consulted EPA on this. I assume you meant letter request and approval by them of a SIP change. Did they? indicate that was appropriate?
Process wise, that is absolutely not. I'm not speaking anything to the reaction or the merits or the judgments
no.
of whether they approve or disapprove what we submit, but simply the process.
The procedure, that's what I'm talking
We've
about, yeah.
consulted on this and the prior process that we shared with you during your November meeting. We consulted with them about that process, both
Okay.
legitimate pathways to meet the July 1, 2025 deadline.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
I'd just say-
Chair Solomon.
I just say that's fine, go with the process if that's what you want to do. But somebody at the General Assembly had the intent of having this become. It's not the process they were asking us to do. That sounds bureaucratic, Mike, no offense. They want a result. They want this result somewhere. And so just by following the process and saying I got it in and they made a ruling on it and it's shot down, that's not getting it done. And I still think, as Commissioner Smith says, and others, that's what needs to be conveyed to the General Assembly on behalf of the rulemaking body, which is us or somebody that will follow the process. We can check the bureaucratic boxes off, but the odds of winning here are not good still. They may be there, but somebody over there needs to understand that because there will be an expectation that we're getting this done. If we don't think this is going to get done, we need to be honest with.
Well, I think we'd clearly state to them that there's no guarantee that EPA is going to respond favorably, but certainly just should report on how the process is, what process is being followed, and what we hope to accomplish here. But that, you may be hearing from us here May, June, whatever, that it isn't working out and we may have to ask him to do something different. One other thing I'm thinking about here is, well, no, let's not get into that. At this point, unless there's some more comment or discussion, I'd just like to take a voice vote on approving the letter to go forward, and we can discuss later whether you want to do something tomorrow or not.
I'm not going to do anything tomorrow.
Okay.
If we're not fully engaging, we're not going to take the whole EMC here. He can write under consultation with the EMC. He can write nothing about the EMC. It doesn't matter to me. But we're not.
Well,
gonna
no,
take this to the
it's
full-
not going to be
We
in
won't
there
take
anyway.
this to the full EMC
Yeah.
tomorrow. No, sir.
All right. Well, let's just, then I would like to get an indication of the committee's position on this and whether you're approve of going forward with this letter approach to EPA. Any discussion on that idea, that concept? And none, then I would take a motion to that effect. Well, I guess we're not going to have a motion because I'm not going to, excuse me?
I guess I'll make the motion with the proviso that an update be provided to the General Assembly as to
Certainly.
the process.
Certainly, yeah, I think that's absolutely the necessary part of
And
this.
the possible implications of this letter vis-a-vis the APA.
Well, I don't think we've got an APA problem right now. Since we don't have a rule that would enshrine that, but certainly informing the the General Assembly, and I guess I should have included that as well as a reference to approving the process, including the letter and consultation by the department with the legislature on the process that's being followed here. And if they're not aware of it, what occurred back in September when we had a not favorable response from EPA. All right, we'll have a motion. Commissioner Bailey, are you going to second or?
When are we going to, I had another question about the letter.
Oh, well, we're in discussion then, on the motion then, go ahead.
Okay, so the first line of the letter says that we're requesting that the statutory language be included in the SIP. We're requesting a SIP amendment, and at the end, I think it's clear that where's the end seems like it's really what we're asking. But I thought the first line was misleading compared to what our conversation is.
Yeah,
right
you
now.
may need to adjust that language slightly then. Let me look at this just a minute here. Come on.
Mr. Chairman, I would agree. We
Yeah.
certainly need to clarify whether the letter is asking for an actual SIP amendment or not, because
Yeah.
it's saying two different things in different
Yeah,
Parts of
I think that's exactly right.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, ma'am.
I do agree with the general concept of what we're suggesting, which is sending a letter and advising the legislature about this, doing that together. But I don't know that, I don't agree with how the first line is written here, for sure.
Let me make a suggestion then, and it's just a slight wording change here that I think would accomplish, and I absolutely agree with your point, because we do seem to be saying one thing at the front end and something different at the back end. What if, in that first sentence, the second line, it says incorporate into, what if we simply change that to say review and strike the words incorporate into? And so simply ask them to review the statutory changes, and I think the rest of it then flows okay from there, and then we tell them at the end the process we're going to follow.
Mr. Chairman?
Uh,
Yes,
Commissioner
I've
Weeks.
been listening closely to the discussion, and I think I understand generally what the problem is, as Commissioner Bailey was articulating it. But I am uncomfortable going forward and voting on a document that I haven't seen in its final form. And even so, I do feel like there are so many questions and concerns that this is unfortunately not a good time to go forward with this. And that's just my comment, but I appreciate the thinking that's gone behind this
Well,
to try
understand.
to meet the deadline.
Well, I understand your other points, but as far as final document, all we're talking about doing, this would be the final document, except for the wording change I just suggested, dropping 2 words out and putting the word review in. Other than that, unless somebody's got something else, so that would be the only change before, if we approve this, before Director Eberzinski signed it.
If I may?
Yeah, go ahead.
So going back to the session law language where it's giving the Department of Environmental Quality instruction by July 1, 2025 to, it says it shall prepare and submit to US EPA for approval by that agency a proposed SIP amendment based on the changes to the air permitting program provided in this section. And so I think we were choosing our words carefully here to make sure we were the department's meeting the session law requirements. And so I think we'd want to just carefully consider the friendly amendments to the first line, make sure that we are still meeting the session law requirements with that change.
Commissioner Duggan.
I think with the changes on a review and the consultation with the General Assembly, if we need to go back and comply with the statutory requirement by July 1st, we still have that time. I think what we're trying to do is get a reaction from the EPA at this point.
Right. Oh, yes. No question. Are you suggesting that changing those 2 words to review would be somehow inconsistent with the statutory language?
I don't know. I think I just want to make sure we're keeping in mind that the language of the session law.
Hang on.
Mr. Chairman.
Commissioner Bailey, Smith, sorry.
So we've got a very squirrely process here, which was foisted upon us. We did not invent this. So there are other places in this draft letter that talk about incorporating the statute changes into the SIP. So it's not just the first paragraph. So I had focused initially on the last paragraph, which talks about an intent to submit it. But there are other places earlier in the letter aside from the first paragraph. And I don't know, they're bottom of page 2, toward the bottom of page 2. It talks about consistent with the requirements of Session Law 2023-134, et cetera.
Yep.
DAQ hereby requests that EPA incorporate the provisions, cites the statute, to be state effective in accordance with the statute into the SIP. So, I guess I'm now confused again about what the process is and ought to be. Partly because I think we skipped a step here when there was no feedback to the General Assembly about EPA's response to the draft rule. Because I think that was the intention last year, was to get some feedback, which would have been in time to allow for some adjustment in the state statute if necessary before submitting an actual SIP amendment. But that didn't happen, apparently. So there's been no feedback. There clearly isn't going to be any change legislatively between now and July. So we're sitting here in a position where there's been no opportunity to make any adjustments in the statutory language if that might have been constructive. I'm not sure. I think we need to be clear about what the letter is trying to do. Either we're initiating a SIP amendment or we're not. I think if we're initiating a SIP amendment, it probably would be better to do that based on a combination of the statute language and a proposed EMC rule implementing that language, which would not be the version we sent last summer. It would be something much shorter that would make necessary changes to our existing rules that would conform to this, but it would not be the entire statute language. And then initiate the normal SIP approval, the SIP amendment process. So my inclination would be not to send the letter as it's currently drafted, but instead to look at what's the appropriate way of submitting an actual SIP amendment to EPA based on the statute language and whatever implementing changes need to be made to EMC rules. And in the meantime, communicating back to the legislature what the initial EPA response was. Maybe that response will change, maybe it won't. But I think they should have been provided that information earlier on because the whole purpose of doing the rule last year, the submission of the concept rule last year, was to get that feedback. So that would be my suggestion, is that we punt on the rule, on the letter. And if the intent is to go forward with a request for a SIP amendment, start getting the ducks in a row to do that. And I don't think this quite gets us there.
And I agree with Commissioner Smith on going through the process. My concern is that, again, as Commissioner Smith says, that the legislature, the state legislature, has had no feedback to this point as to, kind of the effect of the statute and the position that this commission is in. I'm going to withdraw my motion at this point.
Well, I think that leaves us in a little bit of an odd position because the department's intention had been to send this letter. Now, I guess the next question is, if we're not going to approve them to send this letter, what's the committee's, and I actually, I think Commissioner Smith has come up with a good approach here.
I think that's the fork in the road. I mean, I think the department could read this literally and send the letter anyway, I guess, over us. But they're going to have us, when the General Assembly asks, why did y'all let them do this? We're going to say, we didn't let them, they just did it. Guess that's prerogative. I think to do it jointly, as Commissioner Smith suggests and others suggest, is probably the better way. Maybe we charge staff, and maybe you, as Charlie, as the chair of the Air Quality Committee, to make the appropriate rounds to the General Assembly and tell them where we're at, and the department can bring this same letter or modified letter back in May, if that's the way we all feels ready. But I would say let's take 2 months and let this circulate a little bit, have some conversations. Mike, we still may be late, missing July 1, but at least everybody knows what we're doing. And if we approve the letter to go in May 1, it won't be that far delayed off of July 1. I don't think there's a consequence for EPA not getting us back to us by July 1. But I do think we could take 2 months and rebalance ourselves collectively between the EMC and the department and get a mutual path forward. That would be the work I would suggest, but I guess the department could go the other way if they wanted to.
Well.
Can I
Commissioner Scott-
suggest a motion?
Okay.
Which would be two parts. So one would be that the EMC leadership communicate to the General Assembly the response, EPA's response to submission of the concept rule last summer. I think that's more appropriate to come from the commission than DEQ because it actually was a directive to the commission to submit a rule to EPA. So part one is commission leadership communicate to the appropriate legislative body or legislators about the EPA response to the initial rule. And part two would be to ask DEQ staff to come back in May with, first of all, a draft rule that would implement the existing legislation. It won't look like the concept rule from last summer. It will just be making the necessary changes to conform anything in our existing rules that is inconsistent. So come back with the draft rule and we can start talking about that with the understanding that that's a piece that will be part of a potential request for SIP amendment if there's no change in the legislation.
I think that makes all the sense. And I guess my question then is, do we take a position on whether this letter should go forward or not?
Well, I think, just speaking for myself, I mean, my feeling would be that the motion is in place of sending the letter, that we do not send the letter right now, that instead we have this communication with the legislature about EPA's initial response and make sure it's clear that we're unsure what a final EPA response will be, but here's what they said the first time around. And that we start moving toward what would be a SIP amendment package based on the legislation as it exists currently and any implementing rule. And then we'll see if the legislature makes any changes as a result of the feedback they get. But no, not to send the letter now.
Well, that's kind of a wordy motion, but we've got.
Yes, it is a wordy motion.
No, that's fine, but I think council got it though, so I think we're good on that. And I'm in full agreement with you on this. Do we have a second to the motion?
Commissioner Bailey, second.
All right, Commissioner Bailey seconds the motion. Any further discussion, comments, questions?
Can someone read the motion?
The motion two is instead of sending the letter to the EPA, first the EMC will communicate to the General Assembly EPA's response to the rule provided last summer, and two, we're asking that DAQ draft a rule to implement legislation to use in a future request to amend the SIP, reflecting, draft a rule implementing the legislation to use in a future request to amend the SIP.
Let me make one suggestion that we request that they come back in May with that rule language. Because I don't think it's that, it shouldn't be that complex since you're just talking about making adjustments to existing rules and not putting the full text in there. Is that consistent with your?
Correct, yes.
Okay.
So another way to say that is directing the division to come back with a draft rule in May.
Correct.
And we're going to tell the legislature of the awkward schedule problem.
Yep.
And that's where we are, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Any other questions, comments, suggestions? With that, I would ask all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any noes? All right. Motion passes unanimously. And do you have any further comments you need to make today, or can we hold them till tomorrow? Since we're kind of tight on time here.
Nothing further.
Okay. That's all there is, right? Where's my agenda? Then the meeting is adjourned, and the next, what is NPDS, I guess, is scheduled to meet at 12:30. which is not far off.
Go
Unfortunately.
at 12:45 for.
12:45. All right, the NPDS will meet at 12:45. Thank you very much. Well, that's not where I expected to come out. But I, it's